And I think this is a little loud. Telling my secrets already. We do not generally equate Jesus with weakness, but actually with great strength. We think about the very beginning of his ministry, and after his baptism with John, he is taken into the desert, and there he fasts for 40 days. And we get this confrontation at the end of that time with Satan, and the strength of Jesus and the power of the Spirit is so visible. In spite of all that he has gone through, the weakness of the flesh, he keeps responding, "It is written." But the ministry of Jesus is for a reason. Jesus came for a reason. And near the end of that ministry, Jesus says to his disciples that I must go to Jerusalem, and there I will die at the hands of the leaders. And if you remember that scenario where Jesus is talking with his disciples, Peter steps into it in such a protective way, and a way that I think is filled with love that Peter has for Jesus. And his statement to Jesus is simply, "No, this must not happen." But the seemingly quick retort by Jesus to Peter begins with the phrase, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, Peter's love for Jesus was not evil. But what Jesus was seeing in that moment was a temptation. I don't think Peter had any belief that that's what he was trying to do, was tempt Jesus. But that night would come. Jesus would take his disciples into the garden. He would take 3 of them a little bit farther, and the gospel writers would tell us that Jesus would tell those disciples that he was greatly distressed and troubled. And he asked them to pray that they would not fall into temptation. He says to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death." And then Mark continues by telling us, and going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but what you will." Luke gives us some more details about what took place that night. And the wording can be even a little difficult sometimes for us to hear, but I want to begin in Luke chapter 22, beginning with verse 39. "And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, 'Pray that you may not enter into temptation.' And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt and prayed, saying, 'Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done.' And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." I cannot imagine, I cannot experience, I cannot even sympathize, let alone empathize with what is happening. I don't know everything that is going on with inside Jesus. But when I take all of these gospel accounts and I read this one that Luke gives us, and I hear Jesus begging God. And it seems as though God is silent. I've tried to picture what it would have been like from both sides of that. As God looks down, the Father looks down, and I know what he sees. He sees my sin. It's what he sees. The sin of all mankind. The very reason for the incarnation, the very reason for Jesus coming in the flesh was for this hour, for this cup. Yet he's begging God if there's any other way. And God, in mercy, kindness, I don't know what word to use, sends an angel from heaven, and the wording that Luke says is to strengthen him. I don't know what that fully entails, but what I believe with all my heart is that Jesus was at a breaking point. And eternity is on the line. And then in the power that he receives from God, he gets up and he faces Judas. He faces the soldiers. He faces Caiaphas and Annas. He faces Pilate. He faces Herod. He faces a flogging. He faces a crowd that jeers at him to be killed. And he faces the cross. When does weakness equal strength? When our weakness drives us to find our strength in the only one that can strengthen us. When it's not inside of me, but it's when I turn to the one that I have to have. Well, I do not believe that Jesus ever sinned. In times like I just mentioned, I also believe that Jesus was fully human as well as fully God in the flesh. Unlike Jesus, I have allowed my weaknesses to lead me to sin. I think through that night, because it is such an emotional evening, from the time in the upper room, from even prior to that, through that whole evening, I think about Peter, faced with his weaknesses, as he wants to know what's going on, but yet finds himself outside by a fire, being asked about his relationship with Jesus, and then denying it. Like Peter, sometimes our sin drives us to weep in shame and remorse. But it's because we chose sin in the moment. Weaknesses are simply the places where we are most vulnerable. So if Satan is looking to throw his darts at us, then he's looking for the places where we have not fully clothed ourselves with the armor of God. Where for whatever reason we have, either in the moment, the day, or in our life, chosen that our own strength is good enough. But if I'm going to grow, if I'm going to grow in my walk with the Lord, if I'm going to grow in my spiritual life, then I need to examine myself and see where my weaknesses are and not be afraid not just to recognize them or to name them, but to take them to the one who can deal with our weaknesses. Well, I don't believe that self-deprecation is healthy. Self-examination is healthy. Just a few moments ago, as we were participating in our communion together, it reminds me of Paul telling the church in Corinth that before they ate of the body or before they drank of the blood, that they were to examine themselves. Self-examination is not just a reflection of saying that I'm bad, it's a way of saying, God, this is where I need you so much in my life right now. There's no need for me to take the speck out of your eye until I first deal with the log that's in my own. Self-examination helps me to see where my weaknesses are. But as Paul brings this letter that we have been walking through, 2 Corinthians, to a close, he has just dealt with, as we talked about in our lesson last week, about these false teachers that prop themselves up as though they were super apostles. And so he brags on himself. He goes through his own credentials and he lists all the things about him in a way of comparing himself to those others. And he says in chapter 11, verse 30, if I must boast, I will boast of these things that show my weaknesses. And then he starts to tell a story about this man that he knows. And most people believe Paul is talking about himself, but it makes zero difference to me. About this person that was caught up into the third heavens. About this person that had this revelation, that had this experience. And he says, on behalf of this man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So to keep me from being too elated by the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being too elated. Some translations talks about too conceited. Paul had just talked about how all of the things he had done, and talked about this person that he knew that was lifted up into the third heaven. And he says, but when I really look at me, I see my weaknesses. And to keep me from becoming too conceited about who I am and what has been done for me, I was given by God, and this is the strangest phrase to me. He was given by God a thorn in the flesh that he calls a messenger of Satan. God allowed this, whatever this thorn was, to exist because God knew that's what Paul needed. Paul does what so many of us do. He prays. And he asks God for help. Look at verses 8 and 9. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Paul's response is, therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Paul says, 3 times I pleaded. Go back to the garden, by the way. 3 times Jesus pleads with the Father for that cup to be taken from him. 3 times Paul pleads with God to take this thorn in the flesh away from him. This messenger of Satan. I've prayed for God to fix me. But to be honest, it's probably because I really didn't want to do the work of repentance. I'd rather God just fix me. Whatever sin I am dealing with in my life, just remove it from me, remove the temptation, remove the desire, remove whatever it is. Just take it away so I don't have to deal with that anymore. It's an easy way out for me to say, God, you just deal with it, because I don't want to have to repent. I think many times I get the same answer that Paul does. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Paul's statement is, therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses. Grace was experienced by Paul the moment he acknowledged the need of his own inability. Grace would come when he realized he could not, in his own power, go up against what was coming at him. And Jesus steps in to say, my grace is sufficient. God did not take away his thorn in the flesh. There is no account that that happened. Jesus just said, I'll strengthen you. I so want God to take away my thorns. But yet what I know I need is his grace. And it is hard for me to live in grace because it forces me to see my own weaknesses. It forces me to admit I cannot. Paul wraps up this section in verse 10 by saying, for the sake of Christ, then I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I just have to say, I'm not there yet. Sorry. I'm not content. I'm not at ease with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. I'm not there. And I'm not there in part because I have yet to fully grasp what it means when Jesus says, my grace is sufficient for you. I'm not content because I try by my power instead of his power. Because I'm not ready to admit that when I am weak, then I am strong. Jesus says, my grace is sufficient for you. The greatest problem we all face is that of sin. And I can't fix it. As much as I would like, I can't fix it. As much as I may grow in my connection to God and in my walk with God, and as much as I may sin less frequently than I have in my past, as I mature and draw closer to Him, I cannot fix my sin. I can't fix my past, let alone my present or my future. So I don't want to brag about my weaknesses as if I am proud of them. But I will brag about the cross and the grace that is greater than all my sin. So I stand before you as one who desires to keep in step with the Spirit, as one who desires to walk worthy of the calling to which I have been called. I stand before you as one who wants to put on the full armor of God so that I may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. I stand before you of one who wants to produce the fruit of God's Spirit every day of my life. And I can. Because when I am weak, not when I am in sin, when I am humbled enough to say, God, I give me to you, not my will, but your will. When I am weak enough to say, I cannot do this, I just don't have the strength, then I am strong. When does weakness equal strength? When it drives me to the one who will strengthen me. Asking people to help you is one of the most humbling things any Christian ever does. And sometimes we do that publicly. Not very often within this congregation somebody does that. But I know that there are many times in this congregation where a Christian calls upon another Christian or a group of Christians and said, pray for me. Help me. Part of the reason we have a prayer list each week is people who are seeking strength beyond their own. Wherever you are in your walk with God, there's one thing I know. When I am weak, then I am strong. And that's where I have to find myself. Because it's there that grace is sufficient. If we can help you in that walk, then won't you come as we stand and as we sing.